Who has it worse in the city of Toronto? Tenants or landlords? And in terms of the horror stories that you've heard over the last few years, whether it's in the media or through people you know, is the worst story that landlord that couldn't get the non-paying tenant out? Or is it that poor tenant that was being illegally and unfairly evicted? Hi, everybody. My name is David Fleming. I am the host of the Last Honest Realtor. And today we are going to look at the ebbs and flows, the give and take, the battle, let's say, between landlords and tenants in the city of Toronto and more specifically the province of Ontario. Now, I said ebb and flow. How about Capulets and Montagues? For those of you who read my blog, remember I did a post last year when I said Hatfields and McCoys. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about. Capulets and Montagues. Come on, Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. Two families that were feuding, and the Hatfield and McCoys, they're actually real. They were two families that feuded, oh gosh, I wrote the blog, I should know, Alabama, Louisiana, somewhere in the deep south. Hatfields and McCoys. Google it if you'd like, and you'll probably find the blog that I wrote. Essentially, I said that the landlords and tenants are the modern day Hatfields and McCoys. They hate each other. And I say this a lot in these podcasts where I describe the city of Toronto as haves and have-nots, bulls and bears, renters and owners, those that own, those that want to own, and so on and so forth. And it's a really crummy way to look at it, and I apologize. Off camera here, we had a AGM today. That's an annual general meeting. Thank you, David, with Bosley. And they brought in a speaker who was talking about mindset and positivity. And I was so enamored with what she was saying. And then I came in here and started talking all this negative stuff about the city of Toronto. But the truth is, whether I'm writing a blog or my Insights article this year, I talked about bearishness in the real estate market and how it's based partially in fundamentals and partially based on jealousy and envy, and people want the market to go down. This has been one of the constants in Toronto for a long time. And when it comes to the rental market, it's not unavoidable that a lot of that mentality is going to spill over. Now, where we are in this rental market in 2024 is that things have become completely untenable. I would argue, correct me if I'm wrong, that the landlords right now are completely powerless. The tenants have all the power. And unfortunately, I read a news piece over the weekend that said, finally, the tenants have power. And on the one hand, I thought, whoa, hold on a second. You're saying that the ability of a tenant to be legally evicted and then remain there for a year, maybe not paying rent, and then eventually that landlord could lose a ton of money, that you're saying this is a good thing? Is that what you're saying? Or are you just saying, you know what? Tenants have had it bad for so long that it's nice to finally see them have the power. So I want to start from the beginning. The Landlord and Tenant Act, the Landlord and Tenant Board. Two words, phrases, descriptions that get thrown around a lot. You have landlords, you have tenants, and you have the Landlord and Tenant Board that is there to oversee disputes. The problem right now is that it takes too long and there are not enough resources. So what are the issues that are becoming commonplace? What are the biggest issues right now? And as I said, I'll start from the beginning and I'll say this, because I'm going to complain a lot about professional tenants later on. I'll say this to start. It's possible that why we got to the place we're at, where the tenants have all the power, where you have professional tenants, where poor landlords can't get non-paying tenants out, the reason might be because landlords acted poorly for so long. Maybe that's how we got here. Maybe it's because there were so many bad landlords, lying, cheating, stealing, evil, miserable, whatever you want to call it. I'm repeating words I've looked at in media articles that I've collected today, as you can see for those watching on YouTube. But maybe it's because the pendulum swung so far one way that now it's swung so far back. But the major problems are this. Number one, eviction. Number two, increase in rent. Now, in 2017, we were given a new document, a new N12. The N12 is the notice to end your tenancy because the landlord, a purchaser, or a family member requires the rental unit. This is the bane of existence for landlords because it makes it tougher for them to illegally evict tenants. As I said, the two major issues have to do with eviction and rental increases. And all these bad actors who have been acting poorly for so long have now made the pendulum swing so far in the direction and favor of tenants that it's impossible to get it back. So once upon a time, when tenants had fewer rights, a landlord could say, I'm evicting you. Okay, well, what's the tenant going to do? Now, does that landlord change the locks? Maybe. That's illegal today, has been for some time. Does that landlord enter their unit to talk to them? That's illegal. You can't do that under the Landlord and Tenant Act. You have to give written notice, 24 hours. Could that landlord open the door with their key, take all of the tenant's possessions out, put it on the front lawn and change the locks? Absolutely not. Now, this sounds pretty drastic. I'm sure there's a time and a place where maybe that's warranted. Like, let's say the tenant hadn't paid their rent in 10 months. You should be able, as a landlord, to open the door, put all of their possessions on the front lawn and change the locks. No, you shouldn't. I believe in the rule of law. There are a lot of laws I may not like, but I believe, and sorry if this is too existential, I believe that the rule of law must exist, otherwise it ends in chaos. And so if the rule is that if a tenant is not paying their rent for 10 months, you are not allowed to enter their home and take all their stuff and put it on the front lawn and change the locks, then you just simply shouldn't do that. Because I believe in the rule of law. Now, the background to that is I believe that there should be resources in place to ensure you don't get to 10 months, and that's exactly the problem. So I alluded to this N12. This N12, as I said, was brought in 2017. And there is a section on here, many of you are familiar with this. It says, this is a legal notice that could lead to you being evicted from your home. Thank you. The following information is from your landlord. I am giving you this notice because I want to end your tenancy. I want you to move out of your rental unit by the following termination date. Now let's stop there for a moment because you need to give 60 days notice from the first of the month. And a lot of landlords don't know or don't care. So you can't tell someone on September 3rd that they have to be out so you can put a new tenant in on October 1st. You can't tell them that for, so many reasons. But right now we're talking about the 60 days notice. Now the next section says, my reason for ending your tenancy. I have shaded the circle next to my reason for ending your tenancy. My mother would say, this was written by a teacher. Reason 1, the following person intends to move into the rental unit. Listen carefully. Me, my parent, my spouse, my spouse's child, my spouse's parent. Before this document came into effect, you did not have to specify who's moving into the unit. So let me say this. It is legal to evict a tenant for personal use. Personal being you, your parent, your spouse, your spouse's child, which presumably would be your child unless it's a second marriage. My child, which presumably would be your spouse's child if it's a first marriage. Okay, you get where this is going. And my spouse's parent, very inclusive. It doesn't say my cousin, doesn't say my friend Bubs from the football pool. What's up, Bubs? It doesn't say this guy that I met and he's cool and he's going to look after it for me. He's going to pay more rent, so I need you to get out. This form is very important because, as I said, I'm going to repeat this so many times, so don't get mad. The two major issues are eviction and rent increases. So you cannot evict a tenant to find new tenants. You can't do it. I don't like these tenants. They're noisy, or they killed a pig in the living room and they splattered its blood everywhere. Jonathan's looking at me off camera. He was like, did you just say that? I'm trying to be so over the top. Someone can kill a pig and splash its blood around in your condo, and you can't just change the locks. You can't just kick them out. You have to go through the process. I could have thought of a better one, but I saw a duck outside and I didn't want to say duck. So it's true. We have the geese, the Canada geese over here at 103 Vanderhoof. They live in the Leaside Lake, which is located behind us. It's a big pit full of water. So no, you can't do whatever you want. Did you know that you can't evict somebody tomorrow because they're growing weed in there? You can't evict somebody because they're housing an entire basketball team in there. Guys, the rule of law. You can't just kick someone out. You can't change the locks. You have to go through the process. So to find new tenants, yes, ones that don't. I was going through the exorcism. No, the sacrifice. That was where I'm going with the pig. So no, if someone's doing a sacrifice of a pig in the living room, you don't like them, You want to discriminate against them? No, you can't do that. You can't do it to raise the rent, and that's a big problem. So someone's paying $2,200, and I'm going to evict them because this is a $2,800 unit, so I'm evicting them. No, you can't do that. You cannot evict them to sell the place. Some of you are saying, yes, you can. Let me be very clear. Hi, Brad and Becky. I am going to be selling the condo, so I'm giving you notice, not just 60 days, 90 days. I need you to leave so I can sell the condo. Illegal. You're not allowed to do that. What you can do is evict for the buyer's personal use. So the next section on the N12, reason 2, I've signed an agreement of purchase and sale of the rental unit and the following person intends to move in. And then it goes through the purchaser, the purchaser's parent. It's the same as section 1, but they added purchaser. So I have a tenanted unit. They're on month to month. I put it on the market and I sell it. Legally, that buyer can give notice and that tenant has to vacate. That is legal. But people don't go, and I'm going to come back to that. So if you're skimming or you're just listening while you finish mowing the lawn, okay, better mow the neighbor's lawn too, because you got to hear the story I'm going to finish with today. It's absolutely ludicrous. So you cannot evict to move in a friend. You cannot evict to move in, I don't know, what's the biggest charity case ever? Think of a story, this person that's so tough and you wouldn't believe what they've been through and I have to, no, it doesn't matter. And you cannot evict to renovate. I'm going to come back to this. Remember, you can evict to renovate, but you have to, after you're finished renovating, offer the unit back to the original tenant. So that's the first part. We get into issues with eviction. The second part has to do with rental increases. So after November 2018, if a condo was finished or first occupied after November 2018, you can raise the rent as much as you want. But if a condo was built in January of 2014, someone's paying $2,200 a month, and you say, well, I'm going to raise your rent to $2,500, you're not allowed. Evictions and rental increases. Those are the two major issues at the forefront of almost all the disputes between landlords and tenants. So now I'm going to do something so fun. Are you ready for this? I have written so many stories on Toronto Realty blog about illegal evictions. I can't even tell you. And I'm going to share some of those with you now. And I'll say this again. You've got to listen to the whole podcast today because while the illegal evictions are awful, what's happening in Ontario with professional tenants and Facebook groups of people bragging about how much they extorted from landlords to move, the cash for keys, it is so, so bad. But how'd we get here? I'm going to read you an email. Good afternoon, girls. I'm sending this official notice on behalf of John Smith. The name is fake. Regarding the end of your tenancy at Suite Redacted at Number Bay Street. As mentioned earlier, Mr. Smith, sadly, will be looking to sell the unit and will need to do some work on the unit first to get it to a point of a reasonable sale. A move-out date of May 1st is preferable for Mr. Smith. However, as discussed, we'll be extending that date as a courtesy to May 4th so that you can make arrangements and it'll be easier, such as booking moving elevators, and that can be problematic on the last or the first day of the month. Is your BS detector going off? Because mine is. Both myself and Mr. Smith would like to thank you for being such great tenants over the years. And as a thanks, we would not look to apply any lease cancellation fees should you find a suitable new home before May, and any owed rent would be returned to you accordingly. Please do not hesitate to contact me if I can be of any assistance during this process, and I would gladly offer a reference for you should you require it. Name redacted, the vice president of Redacted Apartments. Guys, this is a professional property manager putting her name on an illegal eviction notice. So let's go through this. Mr. Smith is looking to sell the unit and needs to do work. Too bad. You're not allowed to evict someone because you need to sell it. You're not allowed to evict someone because you need to do some work. A move-out date of May 1st is preferable, but we'll extend it to May 4th to make arrangements easier. How nice of you to illegally evict me and then give me an extra 3 days. Both myself and Mr. Smith would like to thank you for being such great tenants, and we will not look to apply any lease cancellation fees. Oh, really? Define a lease cancellation fee because it's actually something that doesn't exist. Now, if she's saying, if you leave earlier, we won't charge you the rest of the rent. I'm going to call shenanigans because I don't believe you for a second. I don't believe that I should give this person the benefit of the doubt that a lease cancellation fee in her mind means if you leave on April 15th, we won't charge you a half month's rent because I guarantee that you will. So basically here, you have a licensed property manager threatening lease cancellation fees for someone they're illegally evicting. It's disgusting. And I wrote this on my blog. Now here's another one. This is a back and forth, and I've changed the names. Are you ready for this one? This is from, did you hear that inhale? I mean, you would think that I'm going to be on the side of landlords all the time, but this happened. And the worst part about this is what happened in the end, because this was one of Matthew's clients. Actually, it was his friend. He didn't put them in here. From the landlord. Hi, Daniel and Jessica. Hope you're doing well. We're just wondering whether you plan on staying in our unit for the next year. If this is the case, we would be pleased to discuss the extension agreement. Thank you and have a great weekend. Sorry, what is an extension agreement? Because that also doesn't exist. That's like the lease cancellation fee that the property manager mentioned. So what do you mean staying in our unit for the next year? At the end of a 1-year lease, every tenant automatically goes month to month. That's called the law. Now, also the law, and I suppose I could have mentioned this and a million other things in my introduction, but I wanted to get to the stories. Also the law is you can't force someone to re-sign or re-up or renegotiate or extend with another year. They automatically go month to month. And last but not least, and this is the funniest part, when landlords believe that a 1-year lease means the tenant leaves after a year. I cannot tell you how many landlords believe that at the end of 1 year, you can tell the tenant, thanks, it's been great. So Daniel and Jessica write back. Hi, Oksana. I made that name up, don't worry. Thanks for reaching out. We're planning on staying for another year. Daniel and Jessica. Here it comes. Hi, Daniel and Jessica. We have contacted our real estate agent. She shared with us the average rental fees for similar 2-bedroom units in our building and in the nearby buildings. We got a response that it varies, it's written in broken English, $3,000 per month. We propose to increase the fee to $2,900 per month for our unit and parking. You can check with your real estate agent and the fees and get back to us on this offer. It doesn't matter if it's $1 billion per month. You are going to abide by the rule of law. Number 1, this person goes month to month. Number 2, you can't evict them for any reason. Number 3, you can't force them to sign a new lease for a year. And number 4, you can increase the rent because this building was finished in 2012 before the 2018 guidelines came in. You can raise the rent by whatever the government prescribes, 1.2%, 1.8. I may not like it. It may be less than the rate of inflation. I didn't like when Doug Ford told people not to pay their rent, but the law is the law. Okay, here comes Daniel and Jessica's response as dictated by Matthew. Thanks so much for reaching out. In the province of Ontario, you can't raise the rent on buildings built before 1991 by the rent increase guideline. In 2020, the guideline, this is an old email by the way, in 2020, the guideline was 2.2%. Therefore, the amount you can raise our rent this year is by $50.60. We are happy to comply with the $50.60 increase. Please find the attached link to the Government of Ontario website. https:// I was going to joke and say that that's what professors used to call it. For those of you that went to school in 1998 when the internet was new and they always insisted on reading that out, www.ontario.ca/page/rent increase guideline. I'm really getting flustered here. Please let me know if you have any questions. So, as I said, this is a client of Matthew's. He didn't put them in this unit. It was actually a friend of his because Matthew started with me in 2019. His friends wrote and they said, what the hell's going on? We told them to write back and they gave them the URL. They wrote : Do you know what the landlord wrote back? Hi, Jessica. Sorry to hear we can't find a compromise. You were great tenants. Past tense. You were great tenants. We didn't increase the fee last year. We have significant increases in maintenance fees 2 years in a row. We will notify you on next steps soon. The glasses came off for those of you listening. Geez. Okay, so this is illegal and it bothers me. And I'm a landlord and I do things by the book. I respect my tenants. It's a two-way street. I wouldn't say I operate from a place of fear, but I recognize that tomorrow my tenants could just stop paying rent and I could never get them out because that's the system we live in. even without that, I would still treat them with respect because, as I said, I believe in the rule of law. Victor and Oksana decided to illegally evict these people. They said, number one, we're increasing your rent. Number two, you have to sign for a new year. And when Matthew dictated this to the clients, Jessica and Daniel, clients, they were friends, the landlord wrote back and said, you were great tenants. We'll notify you on next steps. Now, I said that this one had a bad ending. So here's what we did. And this was during the pandemic. We told Daniel and Jessica, not their names, email them back and just say, let us know if you'd like to abide by the law. Email them back and just say, we're going to write you 12 new post-dated checks. Email them back as though you know and are going to enforce your rights because they cannot do anything. And in this case, Daniel and Jessica moved out. And it really pissed me off, pardon my French, because Oksana and Victor won. And this was during the pandemic and it was a bad time. And maybe you could say, well, rents came down. So, this is dated February 18th, 2020. So the irony here, and I guess now I'm seeing that, is this is this is a month before the pandemic. So let's say that Daniel and Jessica moved out and then Oksana and Victor couldn't find a tenant for 8 months, then I guess what goes around comes around. But the point is, it really bothered me because I pushed Matthew, and again, he'd only been in the business for like a year. I pushed him so hard. These are his friends from, I think, Western. I pushed him so hard to work with Daniel and Jessica, blah, blah, blah. Folks, I have a lot more stories like this, but why don't we take a quick break and we'll come right back to it. Welcome back, folks. Before we broke, I told you a story about an illegal eviction and how ultimately the tenants just didn't want the fight. Let me now give you a better story because this was one of our clients and this was one where the tenants did stay in the end. Good afternoon, Brian. This is an email from the landlord to the tenant. This is a friendly reminder that your current lease will expire on December 17th. Please advise by the end of September if you are going to be requiring a new lease going forward for another year. Thank you kindly. Have a great day, Samantha. So again, we see the issue is that this landlord either doesn't know or doesn't care that the tenant automatically goes month to month. You can't just reach out and say, are you going to stay for another year? Brian writes back, hi, Cindy. Sorry, I've been on vacation the last couple of weeks. I just got your voicemail and this email. Would it be possible to move to a month-to-month lease? Brian. The answer is yes. The law says yes. It's not only possible, that's what happens. Hello, Brian. Sorry, but we're not comfortable providing you with a month-to-month lease. Please advise us no later than October 17th what your intentions would be. By the way, the new rent would be $21.50. Have a great day, Samantha. So two things wrong in this, as with the last one. Number one, they're saying you have to increase the rent in order to stay, which you don't. And number two, they're saying you have to sign a new one-year lease, which you don't. So Samantha, in this case, not a real name, is refusing to allow Brian to continue leasing month to month. And this is mandated by law. Samantha's telling Brian that his new rent is magically $200 more per month, which is not allowed because this falls under rental protection. So she's essentially threatening him. And in a subsequent email, which I didn't include here for the sake of brevity, she has said she is going to start showing the unit to prospective tenants. So imagine this. You are trying to navigate your way through an illegal eviction, and then there's a knock on the door. It's a real estate agent, and they are going to show your condo, and it's listed on MLS, and there's photos of it. What do? Most people panic. Now, in this case, it was one of our clients, and it was Tara's client. And Tara reached out to the landlord and said, hi, I want to let you know how the Landlord and Tenant Act works. And the landlord backed right down. The tenant went month to month, and the tenant got a 2.2% increase. Now, here's another one, and this is the last one I'm going to share because this takes the cake. This is one, and this is a friend of ours in the brokerage who's very big on TikTok, so I kind of just gave it away. She brought it to my attention, and her clients got two emails, one from the real estate agent and one from the owner, okay? And again, it's in broken English, okay? This is from the landlord. Sorry, this is from the agent to the tenants. I send below information on behalf of owner who is in this email communication. Due to government increase rate 9 times last year, rental could not cover mortgage. We need to increase rental from October 1st, 2023. Please attached market rental for address. 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom is $3,300, but we give you discount rate $3,200. Please let us know if it's okay for you. Then the owner writes back in better English and nicer. But again, nice doesn't matter because it doesn't matter what your costs are. And I don't care, and neither should the tenant. Hello, tenant names. I am the owner of property address. I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to inform you that your current lease is set to end on September 30th, 2023. We appreciate you as a tenant. Would like to offer you the option to continue leasing the property beyond this date. Now I'm going to stop right there because again, this person is acting like you sign a 1-year lease and then they just up and leave. We'd like to give you the option to continue leasing beyond this date. You mean kind of like the law does? So it continues. If you choose to extend your lease by 1 year, the new monthly rent will be $3,200 starting on October 1st, 2023. This adjustment's necessary due to the higher mortgage rates, which has made it challenging for us to cover all expenses with the current rental rate. Let me interject there. Boo. Who? I'll continue. The market rate for a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom unit at property address is currently $3,300. However, we're pleased to offer you a discounted rate of $3,200 to show our appreciation for your continued tenancy. Please let us know that this rental rate is acceptable to you. If you decide not to continue renting the property, we will begin the process of finding a new tenant with their move-in date scheduled for October 1st, 2023. Oh my God. Your prompt response is appreciated. Thank you for understanding. We'll look forward to your decision. So many things wrong with this. But instead of me describing it, I'm going to read my friend's email back because I was so proud of her. Ready? Dear landlord name, I have spoken to tenant names about this situation. I will be addressing your email on their behalf. As per the Residential Tenancies Act, any lease is to continue on a month-to-month basis at the end of their lease term. The tenant is not required to give you notice that they plan on extending their lease term, nor are they required to sign a new lease agreement. Secondly, you cannot bargain with the tenants to increase their rent because your mortgage payments have risen. This is a risk that you as a borrower took when selecting a variable rate mortgage. As such, you cannot force the tenants to accept a higher rental rate without proper notice and then threaten to evict them if they do not comply. The Residential Tenancies Act requires 90 days notice for a rental increase, which counts from the first date of the rental period. As September 1st is already passed, the 90 days notice would bring them to a January 1st rental increase. The tenants have no legal obligation to pay a higher rent any date before January 1st. Lastly, you cannot list this unit for lease and search for a new tenant for October 1st. Tenant names do not agree to your terms. To further clarify, you are not legally permitted to rent out this unit to a new tenant unless tenant names provide you with notice that they plan to move out. Under no circumstances may you attempt to rent out the unit. We appreciate your understanding. As I said, I was so proud of her for this, and it really, really angered me because, you know, the whole bad apples thing. As I said, there are a lot of great landlords. I have a client who I think they own like 10 properties. And they're so chill and they're so cool and they always paint and they always clean. It doesn't matter if it's in the lease or not. They're responsive. They fix everything. And, you know, that's how it should be. But then you have situations like this where this landlord and this agent are trying to take advantage of tenants that don't know their rights. And so I wrote on my blog, because this was in my blog, I think a couple years ago, is this ignorance? Because I don't know what's worse. A, the landlord knows this is wrong and tries to do it anyway, or B, the landlord doesn't know. And as my friend said, this is a risk that you as a borrower took on when selecting a variable rate mortgage. You can't just, as my kids would do, and as I explained to them, you can't just, you know, cover yourself in honey and then complain that you're sticky, right? You can't just walk yourself into a potential financial downfall and then turn around and blame other people. So again, I own properties. I've sold properties to clients. Sometimes it's a great investment. Sometimes you got to eat a bit every month. If your mortgage goes up, it has no bearing on the rent that you can charge. Again, if this falls under the rental protection, which this particular unit did. So in this, there were 5 different things that they tried to do. Number 1, they tried to start showing the property before they were legally allowed to. Number 2, they tried to illegally increase the rent. Number 3, they tried to illegally increase the rent effective in like 15 days when it's 90 days and from the first day of the rental period. Number 4, they tried to force them to re-up for another year. And number 5, well, I think that's it. There was a 5th, but I'm not going to belabor this. There's so many points that I can't even keep track. So guys, those are some of the bad ones on the tenant side, for the tenants, I mean. But what about the flip side of the argument? Because at the onset, I said, to be perfectly honest, what's happening right now is criminal. And there are Facebook groups dedicated to tenants discussing how to extort money from landlords, how to work the system in their favor. And while I understand that, I'm going to hold up papers, rattle them so you can hear it on Spotify or you can see it here if you're watching on YouTube. I understand that I just gave you like 3 or 4 really good examples of crappy landlords, but there are so many situations where landlords are legally trying to evict and they can't do it because the tenants know how to work the system. Now, as I said, maybe it's, the pendulum swung too far one way and it swung back to the other. But why don't I give you an example here about somebody that I know who owns a condo. And he's owned this condo, okay? I'll be more specific. This person has 2 children, bought the condo for his daughter to live in. She lived in it. She went to university for 4 years at U of T. Now there's an age gap between her and her brother. So when she finished U of T, they put a tenant in there for 3 years. Now the brother wants to go to U of T, and they emailed the tenant and said this: I hope you've had a wonderful summer and have big plans for the fall. I want to let you know that as we discussed in the spring, my son will be moving into the apartment in January. He's going to start at the University of Toronto and will be living in the apartment while he finishes his studies. You've been such a wonderful tenant for us. We can't thank you enough for the best tenant we've ever had. I hope that providing you with a 4-month heads up, as opposed to the legally mandated 60 days, is helpful for your next steps. Attached is a signed N12 and a signed document, affidavit, that their son is moving into the apartment. We'll provide you with 2 months rent as compensation at the end of the lease, 1 which is legally prescribed and 1 just to say thanks. We wanted to come see the apartment next weekend to plan a few things, so let us know what your schedule is like. So, legally, you are allowed to evict the tenant because your son is moving in. That is in the N12. You need 60 days notice. You've given 4 months, and you have to give them 1 month's rent, and they gave 2. Listen, I know we have a housing crisis. I know being evicted is not fun. This is a legal eviction. But what happens next is amazing. Dear landlord name, my name is blank, and I am a licensed paralegal under the OPA, Ontario Paralegal Association. I'm writing to you today on behalf of tenant's name, for whom I will be corresponding from now on. Ms. Tenant's name is in receipt of your email, dated September 3rd, and the accompanying N12 and statutory declarations signed on behalf of their son. At present, Ms. Tenant name is suffering from financial hardship and unfortunately will not be able to abide by the request herein for vacant possession of January 1st. Ms. Tenant name is going to exercise the rights afforded to her under the Residential Tenancies Act of 2006 and request a hearing in front of the Landlord and Tenant Board. Please provide us with the date and location of the hearing as soon as it is made available to you. Thank you for your cooperation in this matter. Lastly, Ms. Tenant name would be open to a, quote, cash for keys arrangement if one was made available to her with satisfactory terms therein. Sincerely, name of paralegal. So I'm equally as frustrated here as I was prior, because while those landlords were acting illegally and unscrupulously, in this case, you have a legal eviction. And yes, the tenant is exercising her legal right, but that's exactly the problem. She's exercising her legal right to dispute the eviction, which is legal. And I wouldn't have a problem with that if it took 3 days or 3 weeks or 3 months. But it takes a year. And then when she says would be open to a cash for keys arrangement, we're basically saying, I'm not leaving. You can kick me out in 12 months after the LTB. Here's your plea. But if you want to give me $25,000, which is what she asked for, then I will leave. The rent was $2,100 a month. The tenant basically asked for 10 and a half months rent. And we got a serious problem if this is the way that we're doing things in the province of Ontario. Folks, let me take another very quick break, and I'll be back with one of the worst stories I could ever possibly tell you in my 20 years in this business. Welcome back. And before the break, I told you I was going to tell one of the worst stories I've ever had in this business, and I will. But first, I think an appetizer. So February 17, 2023, an article runs in the CBC with this caption: "This GTA condo owner says he's struggling to make ends meet as tenant won't pay $20,000 in rent. After almost 6 months, there's still no order from the Landlord and Tenant Board." This Mississauga agent says he's fed up with the bureaucratic gridlock that's held up an eviction order for 6 months, while his tenant, who owes him $20,000 in rent, lives rent-free in his condo. "I don't sleep at night. I don't eat," he says. "And if I do eat, I eat basic stuff just to make ends meet." Now, here's where some people say, boo-hoo, you bought this condo, and, people shouldn't invest in condos because they're homes. May I remind you that, number one, if someone doesn't own this condo, then no one's able to rent it from them. And number two, the entire way that condos have been built in the city of Toronto in the last 20 years is by pre-selling them. And no, I don't like the system. I've complained about it many times, but that's how we've got units of housing built. So the tenant moved in 2021 and stopped paying rent, $1,800 a month. And he had an LTB hearing in August of 2022. And this says that he was told verbally by the adjudicator that an eviction notice would be issued. 6 months later, that hasn't happened. He calls daily and emails daily. Everyone in government, every institution that I believe in, they've all failed miserably, he says. And this is the problem. We either don't have enough resources at the LTB, or, and I'm not making this up, someone that reads my blog tried to evict their tenant. And when they got to the LTB 8 months later, this was in 2023, and they had put 2022 in one place by accident. And the justice of the peace, if that's the person, or the board member, say the board member, said, "There's a mistake in here. Your dates aren't accurate. Come back when you've done this correctly." And he almost lost it. 8 months it took to get there, and it took him another 8 months to get back, because he had put 2022 instead of 2023. It was an accident. And can we honestly admit that that didn't really affect the contents of his document? So again, you can say, well, that's hearsay, or that's one instance. But I believe, as I'll explain at the end, that we are now bending over backwards to find reasons to keep people in their homes. Now, without divulging too much about myself, my wife is a social worker. Years ago, my wife worked in supportive housing. One of her jobs was to go and do checkups on tenants. She would routinely find people who had not only not paid their rent. Again, that wasn't her job. She was doing wellness checks. She would find people that were exceptionally unwell, but when she found drugs, she had to call the police. That was her job. My point to this story is that she had been to the LTB multiple times where you had police officers testifying. These individuals have not paid their rent. These individuals are doing drugs, growing drugs, selling drugs. And the board says, yeah, but we'd really like to find a creative solution to keep them there. Why don't we all have a meeting of the minds, and we'll come back here in 6 months. So again, tell me I'm right wing. Tell me I'm heartless. I mean, you don't want to know my thoughts and public opinions on other parts of society and government and politics and social work, etc. But what I'm saying is that it is very hard to evict somebody at the LTB. Now that brings me to the worst story, or one of the worst stories of my entire career. And it goes like this. I have a client. He owned at one point 14 condos. I sold 13 of them. Now, you could argue, hey, 13 and 14 ain't bad, and you can always find a way to justify what happens next. But it's so funny, or it's Murphy's Law, that the 14th proved problematic. He gave me the name of the tenant. I emailed the tenant and said, I'm writing on behalf of my client. We're going to be listing the property for sale. Fully allowed to list the property for sale. We would like to have showings. Fully allowed to have showings. 24 hours notice, written notice. Now, usually you ask the tenant, are there certain days we could do it? Are there certain times, blackout periods? I always bend over backwards to find convenience for that tenant. This tenant never wrote back. Finally, I called the tenant and the tenant answered. Now this was and since I'll probably end up going to court, let me say this. This is completely hypothetical. And if it sounds like any other situations, it's not. There's my disclaimer. So do with it what you want. This was in the summer of 2023. And I said to the tenant on the phone, my client, I'm going to call him Jamie. Jamie is going to be selling the condo. And I explained her rights. You have the right to 24 hours notice. You have the right to cancel viewings. I'd like to work with you, etc. You have the right to be home for all the viewings. And I want to let you know, and I'll email you the Form N12 that says that a buyer can legally evict you. And so that's what's going to happen. So I said to her, look, if you have any intention of leaving at any point, let me know and maybe we'll wait for you. I've been in situations like this where a tenant says, you know what, to be honest, I'm going away to school 6 months from now, and I might go back and I'll say to the client, why don't we just wait 6 months? Because if you put it on the market now, it's not going to look great. And then if it takes a month to sell and we give them 2 months notice, why don't we just wait? So she said, I'm not going anywhere. And here's where the craziness started. She said, I'm going through a lot right now and I've got something, and I can't be more specific, but I've got something and it's really important and it's in January. Could we just put this off until maybe February or March? Now this was in July. So I'm saying we're putting the condo in the market and someone's going to buy it and give you 60 days. So she's July, August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March. She's basically saying, could you please just wait 9 months? And I said, look, I'll ask the owner. I called Jamie. He said no. I called her back and I said no. And so she said, okay. And she started to make a lot of noise about access to the unit, who would be there. And I said, look, I'll work with you however you want possible. And she said, you're not allowed to put this on MLS. And I said, well, we are. And she said, well, you're not allowed to. And if you do, I'm going to complain. She never said who to, but it's where it started to get a bit odd. And she said, I have to be home for every viewing. I said, fine. And she said, I have people staying here in some of the bedrooms that you can't enter. And I said, okay. So look, long story short, it was a really awkward situation. And the fact that she was paying $2,300 in rent and this thing was probably worth $3,200, my client didn't really care. He just wanted to sell it. So I did this. I found somebody, a colleague's son, who was looking. And I said, look, it's a $700,000 condo. If we put it on the market and we clean it up and it's a good market, maybe we get more. I said, let's have a look and maybe I can convince the seller to take $675,000. Now that's a lot of money. And you might say, geez, David, you're not working very hard for your client. But at the end of the day, as I told you, the client owned 14 condos. We sold 13 of them. I'm not going to say he didn't need the 25 grand, but he lives in Europe. He doesn't need the headache. And this was already going south. So we did go to the condo and the tenant let us in. The tenant closed one of the bedroom doors and said that a friend of hers was sleeping in there. And it was very suspect. We walked around the unit. She had diffusers everywhere. There was moisture on the walls. It was a scene, man, let me tell you. And despite that, the buyers absolutely loved it. It's a great building. It's a great unit. It's under market value. And they said, you know what? We're first-time buyers. And for a $25,000 discount, plus, maybe we would have got more for it. They said, yeah, we like it. So they purchased the condo for $675,000. And then they signed an affidavit swearing that they would be moving into the unit. My client, Jamie, issued an N12. Before we could serve the tenant, though, she emailed me with a long list of complaints. She said she didn't like that the tenants were looking in the closets. She didn't like that the tenant was looking under the sink. She was worried the tenant might have done something to the pipes. So look, if this ever went to court, this hypothetical situation I'm talking about, maybe, I might be asked to ascertain the well-being of this individual and that maybe there were things going on. I would argue, all sensitivities aside, that maybe I'm not qualified to deduce that, and maybe it's not my client Jamie's place as a member of the private sector to house this individual. I think that would fall more in the public sector. And we'll talk about that later on in terms of why the society and the general public seems to think now that landlords should just be part of the public sector and give housing away. But regardless, it was really tough with this tenant. And so when Jamie emailed, he gave her legal notice, 3 months, 3.5 months, 3.5 months legal notice, filled out the N12, attached the sworn declaration or the affidavit from the buyers. And they're both young lawyers. And they're first-time buyers. They're nice kids. They were super excited about buying their first place and went out of his way to provide even more documentation, a copy of their mortgage commitment to show we're not illegally evicting you here. Now, what happens next? I think you guys know where this is going. The tenant refused access for the buyer visits, refused access, and started emailing Jamie, my client, and myself, and got a hold of the buyer agent's email and the buyers and their lawyer, and started emailing all of us and started saying things like, you've illegally trespassed. So when you go to a condo and you go up to show the unit, right? Are you trespassing? But saying you've illegally trespassed, go and knock on her door. And the buyer agent's a really, really nice agent, one of the best I've met in a long time. And she was super courteous. And she was really, really nice. And she tried to talk to the tenant through the hallway door. And the tenant just wouldn't allow access. So imagine you're the buyer. You've purchased this property. You're excited. It's going to be your first home. Yes, it was a bit weird. It was tenanted, and she had the mystery guy in the bedroom you didn't really get to see other than a photo from the previous listing. And of course, the 5 or 8 or 10 diffusers going. It was a situation. But now you can't get access to the property. So the buyers started sending notices through their lawyer. And the seller, of course, said, yeah, well, I'm trying. Eventually, Jamie, my client, offered to buy the tenant out. He offered her 4 months rent, to which she said no. Then he offered her 6 months rent. He was already giving this unit away for $25,000 less than I thought it was worth. But now he realized he had a problem tenant and he wanted the deal to close. And the irony is, if the tenant didn't leave, Jamie could be sued for breach. Yeah, by the buyers, because Jamie agreed to provide vacant unit on possession. Now, the tenant said no to the 6 months. And eventually, my client's lawyer said, okay, look, let's just see what happens. Let's see what happens. Is she really not going to move out? The days leading up to closing, the buyer agent again went over the property and tried to talk to the tenant through the door. Tenant wouldn't speak to her and again accused the buyer agent of trespassing, which some might say, well, she did. She can't be there. It's a condo. Look, I don't know. But the point is we were trying to work towards a solution. This was a legal eviction. Legal, not illegal. The buyers have every right to evict. They're a young first-time buyer couple. They provided the requisite documentation. Jamie had every right afforded to him under the Landlord and Tenant Act. And the tenant just said, I'm not leaving. So 2 days before closing, the tenant sends a notice on the N12. On the N12, I'm holding it up for those of you looking on YouTube. For those of you listening, this was the form that said, this is a legal notice that could lead to you being evicted from your home. Then it specifies the date you're being evicted and the reason for ending the tenancy. In this case is the purchaser has signed an agreement of purchase and sale and intends to move into the unit. Now there is a section on this document given to us by the government that says, are you ready for this? You do not have to move out if you disagree with what the landlord has put in this notice. However, the landlord can apply to the board to evict you. The board will schedule a hearing where you can explain why you disagree. In this case, the tenant copied and pasted this and said, I am not moving out of the unit, and then quoted what it says in here. And then came the day of closing. That was that. The buyer sent a mutual release. Now, in this case, the buyer's agent, who I've already said such glowing things about, had included a clause that said that if the tenant fails to vacate, the buyer has the unilateral right to terminate the agreement of purchase and sale and have the deposit returned in full. Now, the irony is a lot of real estate agents out there aren't doing this. And let me take one step further back. I'm representing a buyer. I will not sell them a unit that's tenanted in the city of Toronto. I won't do it. Neither will Matt or Tar or Chris or Richard on the team because it's a TRG policy. This can happen. So if you are working with a buyer and a buyer is interested in that unit and the listing says tenant on month to month, but will leave with notice, not happening. We are not putting our buyers in this situation as a result of it. So in our situation, Jamie is beside himself. He's in Europe. He's talking to people that are very unfamiliar with the laws in Ontario. They're saying things like, can't you call the police? They're saying things like, why don't you just take all her stuff out and put it in the moving elevator? She has enacted her legal right. In the N12, you do not have to move out if you disagree with what the landlord has put in this notice. However, the landlord can apply to the board to evict you. The board will schedule a hearing where you can explain why you disagree. So Jamie had a lawyer and Jamie did all the right things and Jamie applied to the Landlord and Tenant Board. 10 months later, Jamie goes to the Landlord and Tenant Board and they say, we hear that you would like to evict the tenant. Jamie says, yes, I've sold the unit. The buyer's moving in. I gave legal notice. And the board says, and this buyer is still willing to buy the unit because it's been some time. It's been 10 months. And Jamie says, no, of course the buyer is not willing to buy it because the tenant wouldn't leave. And the board says, I see. So you do not currently have an agreement of purchase and sale and a buyer who requires the unit for personal use? And Jamie says, no, because as I just told you, and then they said, oh, okay, we've heard enough here. We welcome you to refile and come back when you have another buyer. How's that? We can't do this. We can't let this happen. And on the one hand, I told you the horror stories about landlords breaking the law and the illegal evictions. On the other hand, we can't allow something like this to happen. And I'm going to go into my right-wing libertarian views here, but possession is not 10/10 of the law. And I hear these people that say, this lady lived in her house for 9 years and she planted the plants in the garden and she painted the walls and then the landlord evicted her. It's not his house, it's hers. No, it's not. He owns it. He does. And I'm sympathetic and I get it. But this situation here that I just described, Jamie is now being forced to subsidize the public sector. The public sector, that's your government. I told you I was going to get slightly right of center. Yeah. That's your government and it's their job, presumably, because there's lots of different countries and political systems. Presumably it's the government's job to provide adequate housing. What it's not fair for the government to do is to force the private sector or a private citizen to do their job. In this case, Jamie is being forced to be a landlord against his will. Jamie owned a condo. Jamie sold it. The buyer wanted to move in. The buyer couldn't do that. Jamie went to the board that's there to protect him, through the government that's there to look after his interests. And they failed him because they said, you don't have a buyer, come back when you do. So Jamie's going to go get another buyer. And then what? The buyer's going to hang on for 10 months. Jamie's going to keep this until that tenant leaves. And if that tenant doesn't leave, he is being forced to be a landlord against his will. And might I add, for a massive monthly loss. Now, the peanut gallery says, boo-hoo, which I said earlier, in fairness, but in a different situation. Peanut gallery says, boo-hoo, he's an investor, he should know better. You said he owned 14 condos, he's clearly rich, he can clearly afford it. That's like my aunt telling me that Jeff Bezos should be forced to give away his wealth because it's not fair that he has it all. And my argument would be, but it's his. I mean, in the absence of God, who are you or anyone else to take it from him? And too existential here, maybe. I'm sorry if we disagree politically, but I don't understand this idea that it's criminal to be successful and it's criminal to succeed. And I'll give you an analogy, and this is really getting into politics meets education meets society meets generational values. But when I was young and I got an A, or let's say when I was young in school and someone got an A, you'd put the A up on the bulletin board and say, here are the A's. Somewhere along the line, we said, well, we can't do that because the B's, C's, and D's are going to feel bad. In the same way, There's this segment of society that continues to look down upon those that are successful. And in real estate, there's this hate for investors. Now, all investors are not evil Globo Corps, right? With like Austin Powers meets, I don't know, Ben Stiller from what was the Globo Gym movie? Like an evil character, and they're going, I'm going to crush the tenants. If you want to go and make money and save and invest in real estate and go and buy a property, why does society hate you for that? And I'm seeing it constantly. And you might say, we don't feel bad for Jamie, David, because you said he owns 14 condos, but Jamie cannot sell this condo because this tenant will not leave. And the Landlord and Tenant Board has said, bring us another buyer and we will enforce the eviction. Number one, will they? And number two, how's he going to get that buyer? Now, when I say will they, it's because there is a court case that has shown me that there are people in positions of power who are going to start making up laws. And this is where things get very scary. In Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, there's a family living in a duplex. They've been there for 13 years. The owner gave the N12, now that's the Ontario document, the owner gave notice for his daughter to move in. It's totally legal. The tenants, they said no, take us to the requisite board. The board said that the tenants could stay because they, quote, needed it more. Now, let's say that the owner of this duplex is a billionaire, or let's say he's not. Again, the rule of law, I believe in it. Should it matter? People can say, yes, it should. So the argument is, let's say that this owner of this duplex, he's got 50 other properties his daughter could live in. Why would you evict this family? I hear you. I do. It's not the case. But do you believe in the rule of law? Terminating a tenancy when a family may have no safe place to move is something this court will try to avoid. So basically what they're saying is that the owner's daughter lives somewhere, ergo, she'll be fine if we don't enforce the law. And this case to me was absolutely shocking. And then there's a note here that says, ready? 6 people in a 3-bedroom unit makes greater use of this space than a couple and a regular visitor because the daughter has a boyfriend and there's someone else that's going to be staying with them. The court has decided how to best use private property. I told you I would get political here. I told you I might get a bit agitated. There's always extremes and there's always exceptions. But if the rule of law says that a property owner has rights to their property, and if they rent it out, they're allowed to evict for personal use. It's right here. It's the N12, or it's whatever it is in Nova Scotia. But for a board or a judge to decide ethically, morally, functionally, it makes more sense for the family of 6 to live in the unit than 3 people. I don't know where we go from here. It's a slippery slope. And just to illustrate a point, which might be extreme, but if we're going to allow the government to decide who best suits the property and rewrite laws on the spot, well, how long until we say David's mother lives alone in a 4-bedroom house? That's underutilized. There are a lot of people that could make better use of that house. And to be honest, it's kind of how I feel about the vacant home tax, because I never thought that I'd live in a time where my government forces me to swear under oath that I live in my own home and threaten to fine me if I don't swear. And take the case of, I don't know, someone who's 80 and who started paying taxes at 20 and who paid taxes for 45 or 50 years and is now living in their home that they bought in 1971. Maybe they're spending a bit more time out of the country. They're still paying their property taxes and their income taxes and their utilities, but now they have to pay a vacant home tax because they're gone for more than 6 months and a day. So again, we're veering way out of the scope of landlords and tenants, horror stories, bad actors. But the point I'm making is that while I'm extremely sympathetic to tenants, because there are so many instances, and I've read them, of these unscrupulous landlords, the system we have in place right now to deal with disputes with bad actor tenants is absolutely untenable. and it's extremely undemocratic. And it's given the power of some of these judges or boards to change the laws on the spot. And that's scary to me, because if you had somebody like a colleague of mine who went to the LTB and said, my brother is moving into this unit. And, well, in this case, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, it's a colleague of mine whose dad owns the unit and the son's moving in. And they go to the LTB and the board says to the son, where are you living now? Well, I'm living at home. Where is home? Well, it's, in Lawrence Park. So you're living at home in Lawrence Park. So you're doing okay then? And you want to evict this person so you can live in the 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom downtown on Bay Street? And then that judge says the tenant can stay. That's taking the law into their own hands. And I believe in the rule of law, and we just can't do that. Slippery slope, as I said, and then gave an extreme example. But who says that delving into politics isn't fun or isn't applicable in this case? So folks, let me summarize, because, I got a little off track at the end, but I'm a bit heated. There are so many bad actor landlords and so many bad actor tenants. And for the longest time, the tenants just didn't have the power, but now they do. The Landlord and Tenant Board does not have the resources, and the tenants know it. And you can go on to a Facebook group. A friend of mine who's a real estate agent got onto one of these. You have to be vetted. And I don't know how she made it, because she's a real estate agent. And she sends me screenshots, absolute horror stories, people bragging. Somebody said in Riverdale, they were renting, and it was a tenant who was bragging they got a check for $50,000 from the landlord to move out so that the owner could sell it. And look, the house is probably $2.5 million, right? So the landlord's like, okay, yeah, I got to do it. But that's extortion. That's not okay. That's just not okay. And so the answer is what? The answer is not for the landlord to change the locks in the middle of the night and put the person's stuff in the lawn, because that's breaking the law. But the answer isn't this Nova Scotia case where you have a legal eviction and then the board says, well, we think that this person needs it more than this one, because I have absolutely no idea where that's going. So yeah, as I said, I'll wade too far into the political waters, and I don't want to do that. I've already done that already. If you like what you're hearing, we should hang out sometime. No, if you like what you're hearing, this is usually what you get on the Last Honest Realtor podcast. This is anything but dishonest. I don't know that I can be any more opinionated. I don't know that I can be any more truthful. I don't know that I can say any more things than I just said in the last, whatever this is, 30, 40, 50 minutes that could potentially ruffle feathers or cause negative YouTube comments or people to just call my integrity into question. But again, integrity, is that not kind of a moving target? Right? Now and again, when you've got a landlord and a tenant in a dispute and the tenant says, I want $80,000, and then they brag about it on a Facebook group. Is that integrity? Moving target, as I said. So for me, I'm trying to look at the middle ground. I read you the stories from the tenant's perspective. I read you the stories from the landlord's perspective. I think that the landlord's ones are far worse, and there's just absolutely no safe haven for them in Toronto in 2024. So guys, that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching, as always, on YouTube. Please remember to like or comment, even if it's a nasty comment like I get so often, although lately they've been positive, which is concerning, because that might mean the world started turning the other way. Please remember to like, comment, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify or Apple Music. And please remember to come back next week and watch and listen on The Last Honest Realtor.